Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the 90th anniversary of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. For this 90th anniversary year, we've been presenting short videos about aspects of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. And today we have a very special program that we're going to present to you. It has to do with the history of self-psychology in Chicago, but it's not really just the history of self-psychology in Chicago. It is the history of one of the most important developments in American thought over the past century. And it happened in Chicago, and it started at the Chicago Institute. Many people know a bit about self-psychology, but today we're going to delve into some of the history of it and how it evolved, and some of the subsequent contributors post Heinz Kohut, and you'll hear from three people who are really expert in this area. I'm very pleased to welcome three people to this program today. First, I'd like to introduce David Turman. David is an emeritus faculty member at the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. He is a former director of the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute, and he's been a very active participant in the development of self-psychology, both as a student of Kohut's and then subsequently his own original contributions. Welcome, David. And next, I'd like to introduce to you Jeffrey Stern. Jeffrey is a faculty member at the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. He teaches self-psychology, one of our most popular courses for our candidates and students. And although Jeffrey never knew Kohut, he was a close student and colleague of Arnold Goldberg, who of course was one of Kohut's students himself. And Jeffrey has made a number of his own original contributions to self-psychology. Welcome, Jeffrey. And then third, I'd like to introduce Charles Strozier. Charles is a historian and a psychoanalyst. He was a research candidate at the Chicago Psychoanalytic Institute. David was his teacher when he was a student there. Chuck is perhaps most well known in self-psychology as the biographer of Heinz Kohut. His book, Heinz Kohut, The Making of a Psychoanalyst, has been out for a number of years now, and Chuck has a new book that will be out shortly called The New World of Self, Heinz Kohut's Transformation of Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. Welcome, Chuck. Now I'm going to turn the program over to the three of them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think I will start just briefly and then turn things over to David and then to Chuck, and then all of us maybe will talk some. So it's with a lot of pleasure and excitement that I accepted Erica's invitation to talk about the birth of self-psychology in Chicago. The Institute is the birthplace of what has become a worldwide movement. For the last dozen years, I've been teaching self-psychology in China. There are students in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, all over Europe, just to name some of the places. When the Institute, when I learned that the Institute was going to have a new name, I was excited. I thought, well, maybe it will be called the Heinz Kohut Institute for Psychoanalysis. That didn't happen, but I hold out the hope. Self-psychology, psychoanalysis until Kohut might have been, I suppose, called after what philosophers say. Of philosophy, it's often called footnotes to Plato. I think up until Kohut, it might psychoanalysis might largely have been called footnotes to Freud. Since Kohut, psychoanalysis might be, I think, not unreasonably called footnotes to to Kohut and self-psychology. It has really taken the world by storm, gradually, but with increasing pleasure and interest. It's made psychoanalysis, it's taken away the kind of patriarchy and father-centric aspects of Freudian psychoanalysis. It's opened psychoanalysis to complete equality, I think it's fair to say, with women. It has made a relational home, we might say, for all sorts of people who really felt marginalized, not only by society, but also by psychoanalysis. Gay people, people of complex gender, all sorts of people who were really not well framed by Freudian psychoanalysis, ego psychology, I think it's fair to say, have found in self-psychology a sense of being connected, a sense of being honored, a sense of being welcomed, that has brought all sorts of extraordinarily valuable and creative people to our offices, to our institute, to institutes around the world that have classes in self-psychology. So David Turman, I wonder if you could begin by speaking about some of the your early experiences in Chicago with Kohut and with Kohut's Circle as you found it as a wonderful place to start.
Good. Well, thanks, Jeff. Yes, I was there at the beginning. I happened to have the good fortune, the luck to begin as a candidate in 1965. That was 57 years ago. And it so happened in 1965 that Heinz Kohut was giving his very last lectures on classical psychoanalytic theory to the incoming class of which I was a member. And I was very, very excited by those classes because I thought it was some of the best understanding and the best intellectual contact of anything I'd had since I was in college at the University of Chicago. That enthusiasm was shared by my classmates and had been true for many years. But what was even more exciting was that the very next year, in 1966, Kohut returned to teach our class, but this time he was teaching his ideas about self-psychology, the beginnings of his ideas that later became self-psychology. As he initially phrased it, the filling in of an area that Freud had neglected or Freud had left incomplete, that is the area of narcissism. And I had the good fortune not only of having him that year, but in a number of subsequent years, where he kept, as the ideas were elaborating in his mind, he would be teaching to us. This too was an extraordinarily exciting time. I thought that I was present at the and learning and participating in the most exciting things since Freud wrote The Ego and the Id. It turned out to be even more than of the importance of the ego and the id. It turned into, of course, a whole new paradigm for understanding human experience, a whole new paradigm for understanding development, for understanding the therapeutic process, for understanding the human experience. It was in certain ways mind-blowing. In 1968, I went to Heinz Kohut for supervision on a case. I was a little scared to do it, but I decided that I wanted to have the clinical experience using the self-psychological paradigm that he was developing. And so I saw him in supervision with not one but two cases, it turned out, over a number of years. And that was even more formative for me in my becoming an analyst. At the same time, of course, I was being schooled in classical psychoanalytic theory and technique and was very conversant in it. But the experience of the clinical hands-on with him as a supervisor was added a whole dimension to my understanding of self-psychology. And then, of course, the analysis of the self was created in 1971. It was really kind of the outcome or the product of the lectures that Kohut had given our class over those years. And self-psychology as a movement, in a way, was born. And then many other people participated in extending his ideas. There was a group, and I think Chuck Strozier will describe that. There was a group around him, several groups that first supported his work, and then another group which wanted to create a book showing the clinical applications of self-psychology. I joined that latter group later on as being one of the younger people at the Institute at that time, and the younger people who were interested in self-psychology. And that stimulated my own development further in further exploring both clinical phenomenon and development from a self-psychological point of view. And I wrote a number of papers over the years doing that. In the meantime, of course, self-psychology became nationwide and then worldwide. And people began to realize the importance of this new paradigm and the ways that it opened up our understanding of both the therapeutic process and the development of individuals who came to consult with us. And it became more and more relevant to our clinical work. As Jeffrey has mentioned, it offered also a therapeutic home, if you will, for many people who were deemed outside of the pale of classical treatment, and who came to be seen as much more treatable than had previously been thought, and were successfully engaged in the psychoanalytic process to everyone's great benefit. I then spent my life continuing that development and exploration, as have many others worldwide. I have always returned with considerable pride to the fact and understanding that this incredibly important paradigm originated in Chicago. And I think there were several reasons I think that it happened in Chicago and not somewhere else. Of course, there's the person of Heinz Kohut to thank for that, but there were several other reasons. One, Chicago is in a very fortunate position in not being on either coast, and therefore not as bound by some of the group thinking that it can be prevalent, it can be fashionable on either coast. Chicago's a little removed, and people, I think, could be a little more independent. It's not for nothing that we developed the architecture that we have, that the first skyscraper occurred here, the first chain reaction occurred in Chicago. That's not totally an accident. And I think the growth of self-psychology as being something original and something different from the usual thought is part of that development. Another aspect, I think, of one of the reasons that this self-psychology developed in Chicago was the intense clinical immersion that is characteristic and has been characteristic of Chicago psychoanalysis. Had always in Chicago taken our theoretical learning very seriously. I think the combination of being in the middle of the country, our allegiance to the reality of clinical experience and clinical data, and our respect for theory, I think, were three elements that combine to help make the development of self-psychology in Chicago what it has been. So with that, I will.
So if I can add a couple of footnotes to what David has just said. My experience was I got my PhD at the University of Chicago in 1971, and William McNeill was one first reader, but George Pollack, the head of the institute, then was the other. Two first readers, and I became a research candidate in 1973. I couldn't start classes until 76. But when I came to I had to finish my analysis or whatever. When I came as a kind of protege of Pollack and a protege of really the Freudian side of the institute, I was suddenly thrown into this world of Kohut, whom I know. Kohut had been a family. He knew my father, he knew my stepfather, he knew my mother. My mother lived in the cloisters. So there were family connections, but I was just another candidate. I did have a little stardust sprinkled on my head when I arrived, which was a startling experience. But I had been immersed in this very intellectual world of the PhD in history at the University of Chicago, and I had found it very tedious, exceedingly tedious. And I came to the Institute, and it was the most intellectually alive place I have ever experienced in my life in the 1960s, because the Institute was hopelessly divided. And there were all the young Turks who were, including David Turman, clustered around Kohut, and then everyone else fuming at these new ideas. And it was what made it so, aside from the politics, and there were all kinds of intense politics, but what was so interesting in terms of the intellectual environment was the rivalry and the context and the disagreements were centered on the most intimate kinds of details, so that the dreams in a clinical seminar, not just the theory of reading the ego and the id or reading Kohut's book. So it was both at a theoretical level, but it was also at an intense clinical level. And I think that ferment, I think the Institute for Psychoanalysis in the 1970s was the most intellectually interesting place in the history of psychoanalysis, bar none. Going back to 1913 and Freud's, when he created the Vienna Institute. I did want to add, the fact that self-psychology developed in Chicago is a complete accident. And it's an accident because Kohut's arrival was an accident. Okay. And Kohut was born into an assimilated upper middle class Jewish family in 1913. His father had gone off to the war, was a concert pianist, so he's very versed in music and the arts. And the first day he went to gymnasium, at 10, he got to know a man named Sigmund Levery. And Sigmund Levery turned out to be a very distinguished musicologist. They went all the way through the gymnasium in Dubliger Gymnasium in Vienna. And they graduated in 1932, and they went to the university, and Kohut went into medicine, not specializing in psychiatry ever. Interestingly enough, and Levery went into we began in just a general liberal arts, and then he came to America in 1934 and finished worked on toward a PhD in musicology at the University of Chicago. Then he went back to Vienna, and then was back in Chicago by the late 30s. And Levery was Kohut's best friend, bar none. From the time he was a child, from 10 years of age. And when the Germans took over Austria in the Anschluss in the spring of 1938, coincided with Kohut's graduation from medical school. And he toughed it out for the next year through the Kristallnacht in November of 1938. And he had to get out by March of 1939. he got out of Vienna on the Orient Express, went to England, and had to spend a whole year in a refugee camp in England. And he finally got out of England, and this is March 1940. So the war has started. Germany's invaded Poland, and there's a full-scale war in Europe. And he got the invitation. The Americans had withdrawn. They privileged German Jews over Viennese Jews, and that's the reason Kohut got stuck for a year in England. And the invitation to come to get out of his camp in England came from Sigmund Levery, who was then an assistant professor of music at the University of Chicago, and he arrived in Chicago on March 5th, 1941, and Levery had scored the Passion of Christ by whom? I'm blocking on what the musical's composition was. Anyway, he picked up. Kohut arrived in Boston, had literally $25 in his pocket, just enough to buy a bus ticket to Chicago. He arrived in the morning at the bus station in Chicago. Levery came down, picked him up, took him home. He took a nap and bathed and put on fresh clothes and went to the musical production at the University of Chicago. And that's why he ended up in Chicago. And that's why we have self-psychology in Chicago. It was a total accident. It was a byproduct of the Nazis invading Poland and war in Europe. I guess the other comment, the Jeffrey's interesting comment about one of the appeals of self-psychology, and David commented on it as well, the openness, the acceptance, the sense of enlarging the tent, the psychological tent, is a really very important part, I think, of self-psychology and its future, and partly why it is so appealing. And so that empathy is not gender-based, and it is a psychology. The self-psychology is a psychology of empathy. I mean, and Kohut is the great theoretician of empathy, which people are concerned with these days. And I think it's interesting his personal experience. He was fluid sexual boundaries, is how I put it in my biography. And when he first applied to the Institute in 1943, he was rejected out of hand. And everybody knew Kohut by then. You couldn't get anywhere near him without being impressed with his charisma and his brilliance. So it's virtually inconceivable that he would have been rejected as a candidate in 1943 because he wasn't smart enough. It was because they smelled something different about Kohut, and they were worried about it. The traditions, and it includes Joan Fleming and other people. And they rejected him. They told him he had to, and I spent many years recovering his file, and I finally did get his file. And they rejected him from even beginning a didactic analysis. He was ordered to have a therapeutic analysis before he could even reapply for beginning a didactic analysis. He would have still been in analysis when you began as an institute, as a candidate, right?
So this is because they thought he was gay? Is that what you're saying?
They smelled something different. I don't know. It's not in the files. So one can only guess. But I think it's reasonable to assume that they couldn't have said he wasn't smart enough.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
So you have to come up with, he was very clever. What he did was he chose Ruth Eisler as his therapeutic analyst. Well, Ruth Eisler happened to be married to Kurt Eisler, who were the power couple in Chicago at the Chicago Institute. And what happened was his therapeutic analysis was then turned into a didactic analysis, so that when he finished in 1948, he could qualify for admission to the Institute. So he was able to work around the inhibition, but I think it shows the difficulty people from the minute Kohut walked into psychoanalysis in Chicago, even he encountered this implicit understanding that he was different. He was different. He was brilliant, and he was exciting and open, but he brought a new voice to psychoanalysis. But until he could mature, and Dave's experience of the difference between his sort of ultimately Freudian famous 2-year course that everybody talked about, all over the country, people wrote books about it, they memorized his lectures and stuff, and the difference between—
I still have the notes.
You probably still have the notes, right? That and what he became in 1966, and 1965 is the transformative moment in Kohut's life, intellectually, and when he then started bursting forth these new ideas that really begin in 1966 and last for the next decade and a half until his death on October 4th, 1981.
But you kept saying there's a new paradigm, and I wonder if you could, or one of you could, in 2 or 3 sentences, say what this new paradigm is, or how you would most condensedly describe what Kohut.
Sure, I'd be happy to. When I had taught the self-psychology class, I would often use this particular analogy, which follows that classical psychoanalysis, the paradigm, if you will, or the analogy that one could make about both clinical process and developmental process in classical theory was like embryology. That is the development of the fetus. The fetus develop. Everything is there at the beginning in the DNA, and the DNA unfolds or creates structures as development goes on. The maternal environment has some effect, but the main thrust of development is from the genetics that are there at the very beginning, at fertilization. And in a sense, one could say that classical theory was more like an embryological phenomenon. That is, that things unfolded, not totally there from the beginning, but more a function of tension and frustration. That structure arose out of the innate tensions, innate needs that were programmed in from the beginning, or unfolded as the child developed. And the relationship between the caretakers and those unfolding needs and developments and structures was very secondary. One tried to understand both the drives and the defenses, the tensions and the frustrations, and how the kinds of structures that arose from that. What self-psychology offered, what was radically different, really, was a model not of innate unfolding, but a model of that the self, paradoxically, the self could only come into being in relationship to the caretaker, and that the vicissitudes of the relationship, seen from the inside, seen from the point of view of the child, the vicissitudes of the relationship is what laid the structure down. So there's a whole new model for psychological structure that comes out of relationship. And as they say, the vicissitudes, the ins and outs, the pluses and minuses of the relationship. So the relationship, the developmental relationship, becomes front and center, not simply the tensions or the wishes, but how these are interacted and transacted with with the caretakers, and furthermore, how the responses of the caretakers or lack of responses become also part of this structure. That's a very different way of understanding development, and it's a very different way of understanding what happens in the relationship between the patient and the analyst, in which one focuses on the patient's experience of the analyst's responses, the analyst's experience of the patient, and how those work or don't work over time. That's a whole new paradigm of development and treatment. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
I could say something briefly. Freudian psychology is basically rooted in the Oedipus complex. Everybody knows about it. The little boy wants to marry his mother, kill his father, and the little girl has a similar developmental course. And what Kohut taught us was that so the idea of the Oedipus complex was that there was kind of lust and violence or in the heart of every developing individual. What Kohut taught was that if the needs of the child are responded to appropriately and empathically, the child will go through a developmental period of competition with the father if it's a little boy, and attraction to the mother, wishing to please the mother, and so on. But the violence of the Oedipus complex and the intensity of the sexuality of the sexual drive only occurred when the child was really inappropriately nurtured, when the child was essentially falling apart. He thought that the Oedipal phase, which was normative and basically positive, involving love and pride between parents and children, that only devolved into the kind of over-the-top sexual desire, lustfulness, and the intense aggression. That only when there was early pathology in the parent-child relation, and that's a paradigm shift of enormous.
But it wasn't just the Oedipus, by the way. I had something to say about the Oedipus too, by the way. But it wasn't just the Oedipus that one reconceptualized. It was all of development. The oral phase, the anal phase, all phases were understood as providing positive experience and opportunities for growth, providing that the responses were appropriate to the needs of the child. That was true all the way through childhood.
I think the one could be almost epigrammatic that the paradigm, the Freudian paradigm, is based on the drives, right, of which the Oedipus complex is a part. But it's a paradigm that's based on the drives, whereas the Kohutian, it's a psychology of empathy, and it's a psychology of the self. And the self is a holistic concept, which is both the idea of empathy, which Freud took for granted. I mean, he talks about it in one stray footnote in 1927, and he really doesn't deal with it. And by shifting the focus away from the paradigm of psychoanalysis in theory and in practice, from that of the with the drives at the center of the theory, to a theory of self, which is a holistic idea, and emphasizing, making absolutely at the center the idea of empathy. That's a paradigm shift of enormous consequences. And
empathy understood as relationship. It's the responsiveness, the empathic, knowing responsiveness of the parents to the infant or the growing child that makes possible normative, happy, creative development.
By the way, a note on empathy: the popular expression or the popular preoccupation with empathy. You read it and hear it all the time, and in every field, that the origin of the emphasis on empathy was in Chicago. That was really a function of Kohut's work. If you go through the PEP catalog, the psychoanalytic, the electronic publishing, there's an occasional article on empathy, but after Kohut's paper in 1959, there's an explosion of articles on empathy, which continue. But what's even more remarkable is it's as though the popular press and the population at large was listening to the theoretical discussions at the Chicago Institute about empathy. It's really remarkable how much it is part of common discourse at the present time.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry.
I was just going to thank you for the short course in self-psychology. I just wanted people to know when you talked about a paradigm shift, exactly what you meant
Sure.
as we go on and hear the story of.
We appreciate the question because I think it's important to clarify. I agree with you, Erica. Thank you.
So I was just going to tell an anecdote, which is interesting in terms of the history of self-psychology at the Chicago Institute, and that is the crisis that occurred in 1978. And it's a very interesting crisis, given the history of sectarianism and divisions within psychoanalysis. And Chicago, unlike New York, which has a plethora of separate institutes, and every time somebody gets mad at each other at an institute, they set up a new institute in New York. I mean, I lived in New York for 34 years, and which is probably why I was able to write my biography, because I would come and visit Chicago and stay with David and interview people, and then I would leave Chicago because they were always so mad at me. And but in 1978 there was a very interesting development. Kohut at one of the Wednesday scientific meetings, commenting on somebody's paper, said, "Oh, Joseph Breuer was really the first psychoanalyst in his work with Anna O in 1880 to 1882. Hardly a radical idea, right? But he was the first psychoanalyst." And the context is this hopelessly divided institute, and all the old guard that feels everything Kohut is saying is revolutionary and offensive and needs to be opposed, right? So that night, there were telephone calls and muttering, and Kohut can't be a real analyst because he thinks Joseph Breuer was really the first analyst. And within a few days, there was serious talk of the institute being divided, and Kohut and Goldberg were actually voted off the council. Goldberg really couldn't care much, but Kohut was devastated. I mean, this was his family. He was really unhappy about being voted off the council. And loyal followers, particularly led by Ernest Wolff, started saying, "We need a new institute. We need to have a self-psychology institute. We need to break from the institute." And the institute came that close. And I was a research candidate then. And Arnold Goldberg, of course, had a good sense of humor. He told me one day, he said, "Why don't we just get T-shirts with Kohutian?" But the person who squelched that movement, was Kohut. He said he is the new voice of psychoanalysis, and he hated the sectarianism of psychoanalysis. We all need to stay together, however much we disagree, and we need to maintain the integrity and the wholeness and the unity of the institute.
Yeah. Yes, I remember that. I remember that well. Another footnote to your footnote. I believe it was Arnold Goldberg who was also very, very anxious to separate at that time. I may be incorrect about that, but I think so. But I just wanted to take the occasion also to mention some of the other people around Kohut at the Chicago Institute. I don't think we should neglect them. We all referenced Arnold Goldberg, who was very a prolific author and had many ideas and was a very powerful teacher for many, many years at the Chicago Institute. There was Franz Michael Bosch, who also made very important contributions about affect theory and self-psychology. And the Tolpins, Marion and Paul Tolpin, who were part of the Institute and who were part of the group that developed self-psychology, as was Ernest Wolf. And who am I forgetting?
Well, you're forgetting the Ornsteins.
Well, the Ornsteins,
but the Ornsteins in particular,
yes,
I mean, no one mattered more intellectually than Paul Ornstein.
No,
I mean, I think he was even more important than Arnold Goldberg, but he would every Sunday afternoon, he would call Paul Ornstein and they would talk for 2 hours.
Okay.
So, I mean, he was.
Well, I know the Ornsteins were
Yeah.
very important, but they weren't part of the Chicago Institute.
They were
Although
an
they
ally.
trained at the Chicago
Yes.
Institute, I will say that, but they weren't part of it. So I just to mention, and this was part of this inner circle around Kohut as he developed his ideas, and then later as they wrote the case book. David Marcus also was part of that group, as was Mike Gunther. I don't know if I've left out anybody in Chicago who was part of that. But I
Jim Leiter.
no, he was not. Well, he was not quite part of the group.
Yeah.
He was certainly a self-psychologist, but not part of that group.
The way I think the metaphor that might work is dropping. Kohut was the stone that dropped in the water of psychoanalysis and self-psychology and psychoanalysis at Chicago, and then there were ripples, and each ripple was closer and more increasingly distant to Kohut, and now the waters roiled for a number of years, but I think now they're settling, and the paradigm that he introduced, that rock that fell in the water, is now becoming the dominant voice of psychotherapy and certainly of psychotherapy, but also of psychoanalysis.
You mean in the world?
In the world.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yes. Not necessarily in Chicago, because but in the world, certainly.
But the idea that people could be suffering because they had not been treated well, or they hadn't been understood, or their hopes and aspirations had been looked down on, or in China, in many cases, because they were female, because there was such an enormous privileging of male children. So every little girl, and I've treated any number of them, not just as students, but as patients and as supervisees, the number of them who tell stories of the day of their birth. Grandparents are there on both sides. Father is there, sometimes uncles and aunts. The baby is born and it's a little girl, and all of the relatives leave in disappointment or even disgust. This is the welcome to life. So heartbreaking. And the idea that in self-psychology, there was a resonance, an empathic resonance with the despair, the depression, the unhappiness, the sorrow, and a sense that this shouldn't have been. That this was like manna from heaven for so many, not of course just victims of sexism in China, but so many of our patients, I think, respond to this kind of to the message of self-psychology, so embracing, so cherishing. So it has. There are other movements in psychoanalysis. There's a relational field that is, but it all emerged from from Kohut and from
They're all children
self-psychology.
of Kohut.
They're
Yeah.
all, it's all footnotes to
absolutely.
I think
Kohut
that should be
and
emphasized.
Chicago.
I think that should be emphasized because it is often not understood that the origin of many of these contemporary models are pieces of self-psychology.
I would say
They're
all.
I would say
all.
so, right?
Okay, I yield to
We
my
can be
colleagues.
the Three Musketeers of
There may be a few traditional Freudians on the Upper East Side of New York, but they're a fast dying breed.
Can you describe some of the ways in which that happened? You know, I think, David, you were identifying the members. Was that the self-psychology study group? And those were
It was the beginning of the self-psychology study group, Erica. The people who I identified were the initial circle around Kohut, and the subsequent circle that was trying to develop the case book. Chuck added made the important addition of the Ornsteins. I hadn't included them because they weren't in Chicago. But this was the initial small group around him. I was a young person admitted to that group a few years later. It was after the book was written, but then the group began to expand, or had two people. There were the Shanes in Los Angeles. I think even Stollerode was in that group for a little while, and Joe Lichtenberg from Washington. So they're more of became a somewhat larger national group before there was the self-psychology organization, the International Association of Psychoanalytic Self-Psychology, that developed later.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to note that the group, capital G,
Yes.
which was 1974 to 1980, the one this was the core group that included the Ornsteins, and they met, and it had a kind of a cultic quality, but they self-consciously allied them or modeled themselves on the group around Freud, who would meet on Wednesdays in his home starting 1902 until he created the Vienna Institute in 1913.
Yes.
So and they would joke sometimes, who was the Otto Rank? And God knows who was the Carl Jung, the real dissident. So there was an awareness of those who were around Kohut, that they were creating something a new paradigm, a radically new thing, and they modeled, they used this historic precedent to help explain to themselves what they were, the project that they were engaged in.
I think I heard that Heinz sometimes referred to them as the Jungen.
Absolutely,
So,
absolutely.
After Freud's disciples.
He didn't, Freud, after a break with Jung in 1912, Freud gave all of his followers special rings, and they all wear. They at least Kohut did not give his followers rings. Right?
No rings.
No Lord of the Rings.
No Lord of the Rings.
Lord of
That's
the
right.
Rings, right.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the kinds of ideas that sparked off of Kohut. How did they? What were especially? I guess I'm especially interested in the early group around Kohut and the next generation of them, of course, because they're, I guess, primarily Chicagoans. But I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the kinds of ideas that, David, that you and others had that have really enriched the theory of self-psychology and how we think about it today.
Could I begin?
Sure.
Because I think I can be very concrete in that answer. But Kohut, as David and I completely agree, really is the major theoretician of empathy. And empathy, as he first defined it in his famous 1959 paper, it is really an epistemological thing. He said the way of knowing in psychoanalysis is empathy. We can describe things objectively, and that other scientists do that. But the way we understand anything psychologically is empathically. And he defined empathy as vicarious introspection. So, and it was a very tightly organized sort of scientific paper. And he never stopped talking or thinking about empathy. He never, maybe in classes, but he never wrote again defining empathy as vicarious introspection, because as he realized, as he expanded both in his clinical work and other kinds of work, he expanded the meanings of empathy as really the essence of cure. So it's not just the way of knowing in psychoanalysis, which is completely missed by Freud, incidentally. It becomes it become by the mid-70s, he talked about it as the oxygen of psychological life. That is, in the same way that a fish has to swim in water, we have to swim, we have to breathe empathy. And what he gradually moved toward is the idea that it's the essence of cure, and that empathy heals, which is the argument in the final book, that empathy heals, and that even without anything happening, in his final lecture 4 days before he died, even without anything happening, if there's empathy, there's healing. And that he actually says something radical in that final lecture that he didn't have time to develop, which is that interpretation and explanation are higher forms of empathy. So that it became the definition of cure from this sort of scientific definition in 1959. It became an increasingly expansive understanding and really the core of what we mean by cure in psychotherapy or psychoanalysis.
Could I make an emendation to that, Chuck? Because you talk about empathy, and yes, of course, but the whole issue of what empathy consists of is subjective experience. That what's so important in understanding oneself, and the other is understanding the subjective experience of anyone, the inner experience. And there's no way to understand the inner experience of anyone, the inner affective psychological experience of anyone, except with some reference to one's own experience of inner experience. In other words, you can't measure it externally. The only way you have access to it is by being open to inner experience in yourself and in the other person. So subjectivity, empathy reinforces the importance of subjectivity in understanding anything about human experience. It's understanding subjectivity. And that's, of course, what psychoanalysis does in spades. Psychoanalysis is the exercise and understanding and immersion in subjective experience.
And the only path is empathy.
What, dear?
And the only path to that is empathy.
That's right. That's right. Exactly. That's exactly right.
So I would add major ideas in psychology have to do with self-esteem, crucially, and narcissism. So instead of feeling crucially bad because we're not having pleasant sexual experiences, our libido is dammed up, is largely what Freud talked about, finding ways to make the unconscious conscious. In self-psychology, the idea is we feel bad when we feel disapproved of, when we feel that our desires are forbidden, that when we feel enhanced, when we feel admired, when we feel appreciated, when we feel cherished, and when we feel the opposite, then our self-esteem collapses. So it's Kohut also made a huge. There was the idea of narcissism was quite negative. If you were said to be narcissistic, that meant you were arrogant, you were haughty, you were overly proud. You shouldn't be narcissistic. And Kohut
Still means that.
It still means it. It still means it. But Kohut thought that self-regard, that healthy narcissism pleasure in one's functioning, joy in the figures that one idealizes, the people and figures that we look up to, the religious figures, for instance, that all of these, that this sort of thing was self-enhancing and a source of wholeness and emotional health. So got rid of the idea that somehow humility, humbleness was to be privileged.
Exactly, and
Yes.
and why he actually stopped talking about narcissism
And
because of this dilemma, good narcissism and bad
Right,
narcissism.
right.
And around 1974, he started talking about the self.
right.
And the self, and that's why self-psychology emerges. His first book in 1971 is all about narcissism.
Right.
And he had tried since a famous paper in the late 60s, he tried to make this
1966.
66 to try to make this forms and transformation, tried to make the distinction between good and bad narcissism, and it didn't work very well. But after a few years after the publication of the first book, he started talking about the self, because the self is a holistic concept. It is intrinsically holistic, so that the self tilts toward wholeness, toward health, and the task is not to regress to some archaic state in order to get well. The task is to tilt the listing ship back upright, and that's a profound philosophical difference from much of psychoanalytic sense of cure, and I think moves toward the yearning of Americans after war and Holocaust toward empathy, toward understanding, toward wholeness, and toward inclusivity
and connection. I mean, I think that one of the things that Goldberg used to teach, I don't know if this was something that you learned from Kohut, but he would say the self is not limited by our heads. We are made up of our relationships, our self-object. The self-object is the responding other. So we are comprised not only of ourselves, but the people who are vitalizing to us. That's why we feel so destroyed, so depressed if we lose someone, someone dies, for instance. So the idea of empathy connected to connection, and the idea of the self expanded by the surround, that's all central to self-psychology.
Let me add something else that I think is also very important, and it was also part of the revolution of self-psychology. It is true that what Chuck said about Kohut's abandoning the term narcissism because of its negative connotations in favor of the self. But before he abandoned it, he also showed the importance of things of needing to be special, of wanting to shine, of wanting to be those kinds of feelings of childhood that are, quote, narcissistic. And he did for those feelings, when he said, these are, if they are responded to appropriately, they become some of the most valued things in human character. That is, these, quote, narcissistic needs become empathy, humor, acceptance of transience, creativity, wisdom. The transformations of these things become some of the most important things we value. And so in a sense, what he did for, quote, narcissism, for some of these self-involved feelings and self-assertive and self-showing needs, what he did for those is that he normalized them in a way so they're part of normal development. And he did that the way Freud did for sex. Childhood sexuality was this terrible, terrible thing. Freud said, no. We need to understand that, and it develops into very important structures later on. Kohut did the same thing for, quote, narcissism, which became self. And furthermore, as he did that, he also challenged a very important Western moral value, and that is that one should abandon feeling or needs for oneself and preoccupation for oneself, and one should become only altruistic, only concerned with the other. That is, that these kinds of needs became, in classical terms, object love. And he said this is a remnant of Western moralism, which says that in a sense you yourself should disappear and you should be only for the sake of others. And he said, no, that's not the desired outcome of these fields. What, pardon?
He called it a bias.
It's a bias,
Right.
exactly. It's a prejudice. These are not. And in fact, again, these, quote, narcissistic needs become these most valued aspects of character development. And thirdly, and finally, and very importantly, that we cannot develop these things without again, going back to the paradigm, without the relationship, the responsiveness of the caretakers. That is the self-object. What's crucial for the development of the self is the self-object, the others who function as in needed psychological ways, and which again comes back to the connectedness that we're never complete, really, ever, without the experience of connection with others, which complete ourselves. And there's and finally, that, and this is some of my work, that the imprint, that the experience of the self-object in childhood is the responses of the self-object, the responses of the caretaker become an indelible part of who one is, and how, and both positive and negative, and those become like imprinting templates in one's development, and we have to be aware of that in a therapeutic situation, and be aware of it in general, of the power of the self-object imprinting the template of the self.
New book, I have a whole chapter about this, that you need to dive in really getting into Kohut in depth. You need to immerse yourself in what he meant by the term in order to find a way out of it. And what he's talking about is other, and it's an I-thou relationship, and self and other, and we need to avoid this. I mean, the whole the self-object, the self is a long tradition in philosophy and psychology, and it's a legitimate, we know what we mean, at least we begin to know what we mean when we talk about self. Object is Freud's term from 1905, and it's a horrible, the object of our libidinal desires, and it turns, spouses and children and neighbors and parents, people we love and make a life with, into objects as the mere object of our libidinal desires. And that's a horrible, deadening, inhumane kind of term. And I think it's one of the problems of what I argue in my new book is Kohut needs to be relieved of his language. And I think that's a very important way of moving forward, of making the self-psychology more universally available. And I think this idea of the self-object, I mean, I completely agree with everything that Dave said, except we need to always avoid the word self-objects. And remember, in the tradition of Buber, he's talking about an I-thou tradition. That I is only in relationship to thou.
I have to steel myself.
We're in communion with others.
Right, I have to steel myself when I use the term. Yes. So now I understand why I have to steel myself.
So I will say briefly something that actually doesn't, it seems to me that what Chuck just said could certainly be the ending, but I wanted to say, because I was moved by it in response to thoughts after what David was talking about. In Freud, there is a pressure toward what he calls object-relatedness, meaning the baby is seen to be narcissistic. The baby only is interested in herself or himself, and in the course of development, ceases to be an autoerotic being and becomes connected to or attracted to an appropriate object relationship. And that's generally seen as a heterosexual relationship, but certainly it's important, necessary to love an other if one is to be regarded as evolved, as healthy. And Kohut basically said that the world is full and has been full. Some of the most valuable human beings from the beginning of time have not been heteronormative, have not necessarily been interested in love relationships. There have been artists, musicians, creators, philosophers, architects, all sorts of people have done extraordinarily important and valuable things with their own narcissism as the primary motivation. So I wanted to say that, and then I wanted to thank my colleagues and thank you, Erica,
Thank you.
for this this self-object connected,
our connected
energetic. It seems to me
Overly long.
it seems to me that as we talked, all of our energy went from a kind of, oh, we got it. What are we going to say? How are we going to fill the time? To wait, I want to talk. No,
right.
let me talk.
Right. Thank you.
Well,
Psychology does, and this is what Chicago psychoanalysis does.
Here for Chicago. Let's hear it for Chicago. Rah.
this is our ideal. But seriously, thank you, Chuck. Thank you, Jeffrey. Thank you, David, for sharing your creativity and your wisdom and as your narcissism has transformed. It's been wonderful, a wonderful conversation. And I think everybody who's listening will see that we've only just begun this conversation, and maybe we'll continue it one day.